Hello, and thank you for listening to the Understanding Your Users workshop. To go over the agenda, we are first going to review the pre-workshop activity about website goals. Next, we will talk about defining your users and different types of audiences, why it's important to understand your users, a few different methods for identifying user needs, as well as a short activity towards the end where you will be creating a user persona for your primary audience. Of course, if you have any questions about the information covered today, feel free to reference our content strategy documentation, which will be linked at the end, or email Web Services at webservices@georgetown.edu. Like I mentioned, I first wanted to go over the pre-workshop activity we had you all complete, which was about defining your website goals. Now, if you haven't already, using the questions as prompts, I'd like for you all to pinpoint 2 to 3 clear goals for your website. As an example, a website goal can be something like wanting to increase the interaction between your organization and its users. And while you write these goals, I'm going to talk about why it's important to have website goals and how having these goals will help you understand your users. Crafting website goals is an essential step of the content strategy process, as it acts as a foundation and a great resource to reference when you are unsure what to do next. And when I talk about content strategy, I'm referring to the creation, development, and management of the content on your site. Essentially, content strategy is a process to ensure you are creating useful and usable content for the users that are visiting your site. Having goals is going to help you identify a clear purpose for your website, which will lead to more cohesive and useful content. And having these goals is going to help you understand your users because they will help you understand what kind of goals or tasks you want your users to accomplish while on your site. Going back to the example I used earlier, if one of your website goals is to increase communication between your organization and your users, then perhaps one of the goals or tasks you would like your users to accomplish would be to sign up for an informational newsletter. To summarize, having clear goals will help you center your content around a common purpose. It will be a great resource to reference whenever you're feeling unsure about the content you want to develop. Moving on now to defining your users. So you may already know that you have a variety of users that are visiting your site. And these different users can be grouped into different user groups or audiences, such as your primary, secondary, and even tertiary audiences. And while it's definitely important to pay attention to all of your different audience groups, it's especially important to pay attention to your primary audience, or the specific group of users you want your message to reach. I want you all to think about and quickly note down your primary and secondary audiences. If you're unsure who your primary audience could be, you can reference question 4 on the pre-workshop activity. Which group of users do you think best aligns with your website goals? To give an example of different audiences, for an undergraduate or graduate program site, the primary audience might be prospective or current students, as this is the main group you want your message to reach. A secondary audience for a site like this could be parents of those students. While the parents might not be the main group of users you want to reach, they are also important to pay attention to as they can influence your primary audience's decision or even bring the website to their attention. It's important to pay attention to all the different user groups that are visiting your site, since they might have different needs, expectations, or struggles while on your site. But the main group you should focus on would be your primary audience, and this is a specific group your message is intended for. So why is it important to understand your users? Well, oftentimes we can forget why we create websites in the first place, and especially who they are for. It's important to take a step back from the daily life inside of your organization and try to start to build empathy for your users by putting yourself in their shoes. By doing this, you can understand how your users navigate your site, the kind of content they're looking for, what they have difficulty with, either finding or tasks they struggle to complete on your site, as well as their needs. And your users' needs are especially important because in reality, your users' needs should be what guides the content you develop and ultimately how it's going to be structured on your site. It's important to remember that you are not your user. Oftentimes, we think we know everything about our users without taking the time to get to know them or figuring out what their needs and expectations are from us. If we don't take the time to understand and build empathy for our users, we can overlook something simple that we might not have noticed because the whole time we were looking at the website through the organization's perspective, instead of through the perspective of a new user. Now, moving on to the different methods of identifying user needs, the first of which being user interviews. And really, the name defines itself. User interviews are interviews of your users. And so the steps to conducting a user interview is first to decide who you will be interviewing. We recommend conducting between 5 to 10 interviews. It's important to have the majority of the users you are interviewing from your primary audience, but be sure to include from your secondary and even tertiary audiences as well, since they might have a different perspective or experience on the site. And it's great to have a well-rounded view of how people are interacting with your site. The next step would be to develop interview goals and questions. It's important to create interview goals beforehand, as this will help you guide the direction of the interview. You don't want your interview goal to be something too broad, like learn about your users. A better goal would be something like, what information do prospective students look for on my website? This goal is concise, concrete, and relates to a specific aspect of the user's behavior on your site. Creating questions is going to give your interview structure. And there's typically 2 ways to go about creating these questions. You can opt for a structured interview, in which you will create a concrete set of questions you ask all of your users. And the second way to go about this is to opt for a semi-structured approach, which we typically recommend over the structured approach. For the semi-structured interview, you will create a list of questions and leave room for any organic follow-up questions you think could be beneficial. This method is more conversational and can make the person you're interviewing feel more comfortable, which can often lead to better answers and information. A couple of things to note when creating questions is to avoid leading and close-ended questions. A leading question can lead to a biased answer. And this can look something like, what do you think this button does? This can be considered a leading question because it can bring attention to a certain aspect of your site the user might not otherwise have noticed. Closed-ended questions should be avoided because they can cut off the conversational flow and potentially lead to an awkward bit of silence, as they result in yes or no answers. It's best to ask open-ended questions whenever possible to maximize the time spent interviewing and the information you're getting out of it. And to give a few examples of questions that you can ask during a user interview, you first want to start off with a few introductory questions, such as, tell me about your relationship with the organization. After a few of these introductory questions, you can then move on to more behavioral questions. And these questions should really answer your interview goals. So examples of behavioral questions are, how do you normally get to this information page? And is there anything you often look for on the site that is hard to find? You can find more example questions for user interviews by visiting our content strategy documentation page. The next method we are going to talk about is user personas. A user persona is essentially a fictional character that represents a specific group that visits your site. Personas should create reliable and realistic representations of your different audiences. They should also express the needs and expectations of that group and be backed up with research. And by research, I mean either information gathered from user interviews, real-life experience with your users, and even data from analytical tools like Google Analytics. And just a quick note on Google Analytics, while it's a great resource to start off with, it is an imperfect tool, and the best information is really going to come directly from your users. So whenever possible, try and interact with your users directly. Personas should typically include the following information: the persona or user group they belong to, a fictional name, a job title and responsibilities, demographic information such as age, marital status, family status, education, and even income can be helpful. They should also include goals and tasks the persona wants to accomplish either in their personal life or goals and tasks pertaining to your website. You also want to include their physical, social, and technological environments. Physical environment meaning where they live or even where they are when they're viewing your site. As in, are they home, are they at work, or are they maybe in a coffee shop? All these different environments can influence the way that they interact with your site. Social environment meaning, are they introverts or extroverts? Do they have a busy social life? And technological environment can consist of their experience with technology, as in, are they tech savvy? This is especially important important to note since we are creating these personas for users that visit your site. So someone who is more tech savvy might not have the same experience as someone who is not so much. A nice touch to add to your personas is a quote or a catchphrase. This can either be something that they might say in their daily lives or something that summarizes the needs or situation that they're currently in. The picture for a persona is also a great touch as it helps reinforce the illusion of a real person. However, it's important to note that when adding a picture, you don't want to use a picture of a celebrity or anyone you might know from the office because it might create bias when you're developing your persona. And I'll be showing an example of a persona that I created once I go over the next slide, which is going to be about user scenarios. So user scenarios are pretty interrelated with user personas. A user scenario is a method of storytelling that focuses on the what, how, and why of a user's interaction with your site. These scenarios are created by stepping into the minds of one of your personas and will help you envision how your users are interacting with your site. The more details you include in your scenario, typically the more helpful it is. You'll want to create user scenarios for the different tasks or goals you want your users to accomplish on your site. And then, of course, create these scenarios with the different personas you have created, since each persona might have a different experience completing the task or goal. To start, you'll want to make sure you create a list of goals, motivations, and other contextual information for your persona that you might need for the particular scenario you are crafting. And you can pull the majority of this information from the goals and motivations section of your user persona. Next, you'll want to create a narrative that includes who they are, why they are using your site in this particular scenario, where they are, what they need to do, and how they go about accomplishing their goal or task. And to help you visualize how this might all look put together, I went ahead and created an example of a user persona and a scenario that goes with it. The persona and scenario I created is completely unrelated to Georgetown sites, just to not confuse or influence any personas or scenarios that you might be creating in the future. So this particular persona was created from the perspective of a company called Good On You. And this company provides sustainable and ethical ratings of different clothing brands. And so I'll start by going over the persona first. There's quite a bit of information on this slide, so I'll just briefly talk about what I put and why. So I gave this persona the name Nancy Martinez, and I included a short little description of the user group that she belongs to and kind of what she hopes to accomplish. This is a great touch to add to your personas as it'll help you quickly identify the persona and really who they are and what they're about. As you can see, I included her age, marital and family status, her educational background, and her job, which is an interior designer. For her environment, I noted she lives in Alexandria and she has a busy work and social life. I noted that she is new to the sustainability world and is looking for simple alternatives she can implement in her life, which is kind of her goals or tasks that she wants to accomplish. And for her technological environment, I noted that she uses a computer on a daily basis, so she's pretty comfortable navigating the web and mobile devices. I also noted some of her motivations and anxieties, such as the price of living sustainably, her motivation to be a good role model, and another anxiety, which is the overwhelming amount of information that she finds. And you'll notice that I bolded a few phrases and words throughout the persona in this scenario, and this is just a way for me to highlight the important information and kind of show you where I'm grabbing my conclusions from. So for this particular scenario, it's based on Nancy's first interaction with the company. So that's the scenario I'm creating. And for this particular scenario, Nancy has just finished dinner and is scrolling through Instagram on her living room couch when she notices an ad for the company Good On You. She sees the company focuses on sustainable fashion, which is one of her interests. So she decides to click on the ad, which then brings her to the website's homepage. As someone in the creative field, she appreciates the clean and modern design of the site and skims the homepage to quickly get an overview of the information. She learns she can look up different brands and decides to start with her favorite brand to see their rating, which is Zara. So she sees the brand rating, which is It's a Start, And she also notices that the company is providing her with brand alternatives that are similar in style and price points to Zara. And she loves how quickly she was able to get this information and find great alternative brands. Nancy then decides that she wants to download the app for quick and on-the-go access to the information. And so you'll notice Nancy liked that there were listed alternatives she could easily implement into her life, which was one of her goals, that she wanted to have simple alternatives. The similar price points from the alternative brands eased her anxiety about staying within her budget. And the quick access to the information fits in perfectly with her busy lifestyle. And so to summarize personas and scenarios, you can really go extremely detailed or just stick with the key points, but it does help to get in your user's mindset by creating more detailed personas and scenarios. By having these extra details, you'll be able to create more realistic scenarios, which is going to help you understand how different users are experiencing your site and having those first interactions with your organization. Now we are going to move on to the practice activity, which will be creating a persona for your primary audience. We've created a template you can fill out, which you can access by clicking on the link text, Create a Persona, on the slide. The template will have sections of the information you should include, but to quickly review what you'll want to include, you're going to want to include their name, demographic information, their job title and responsibilities, their goals, their physical, social, and technological environments, as well as a quote or a catchphrase. Feel free to pause the video and take the next 10 to 15 minutes to complete this exercise. And just a reminder that this is a template, so you'll want to make sure you create a copy before editing the document. And to create a copy, you're going to go to File on the upper left-hand corner, then click Make Copy. And once you've completed your persona, feel free to share and get feedback from members on your team or by emailing Web Services. We'd love to hear about your persona and help answer any questions you may have had while creating them. And a tip to creating well-rounded personas is by getting input from a variety of people on your team. So don't be shy to share your work. With the activity completed, I wanted to wrap up the workshop by reviewing some of the key points we hope you all remember from this workshop. Starting with the first topic about defining your users. Remember to reference your website goals and try to identify the different user groups or audiences on your site to make sure you include their perspective when creating content. It's important to understand your users and their needs, as it will allow you to build empathy for them and help understand how they navigate your site, any pain points that they may have had, and it'll also help you understand what they need from your site, which is ultimately going to guide your content that you develop. To go over the methods for identifying user needs, we first talked about user interviews, which should represent users from different groups, such as your primary, secondary, and tertiary audiences. And we also talked about the importance of creating goals and questions for your interview beforehand. We also talked about personas, which should be a reliable and realistic representation of your users and be backed up with research. And lastly, we talked about user scenarios, which will help you envision how your users interact with your site, and they should be a narrative that focuses on the what, how, and why of the user's interaction. And by using these different strategies to identify your users' needs, you'll be able to better understand the content they are looking for, and therefore will be able to develop content catered especially for your users. With that being said, this concludes the Understanding Your Users workshop. Before we end, I do want to bring attention to future workshop topics we will have, so keep an eye out for when it's time to register for those. I also want to mention our content strategy documentation, which has great in-depth resources for the content we talked about today. Please don't hesitate to email us with any questions you may have had throughout the presentation, and thank you for listening.